this morning we are going to begin a whole new section. And I have to tell you, as I've been going through and studying this book, I'm hoping you guys are seeing that Paul has a flow and a logic to everything that he's doing in the letter. This is one of those letters where we seem to grab sections or verses or pieces or parts or phrases or things that we go, here's some really great stuff here. But as I've been going through it and as I continue studying into the next sections of the book, this is really a wonderfully logical presentation. It all fits together, even though it looks like there's lots of different pieces to it. It's just sort of like standalone blocks. And we have to always be careful when we take standalone blocks and then just use them for some purpose they may or may not have been intended. There are places in scriptures where if you take the if you will, quote the verse, you don't understand that what the context of what the statement was made, it can be misused. And I'm not saying that we do that a lot with these verses, but I think that there's a lot more clarity when we see the flow of the arguments. And that's I think is really important here as we're looking at chapters 8, 9, and 10 over the next 3 weeks. And these chapters are taking on one topic, dealing with food sacrificed to idols. And yet, next week you're going to go, well, wait a second. Paul's making this whole different argument. He's not talking about food and idols. Well, in reality, he is. Because this week, if you notice the outline that we have, we're going to be looking at chapter 8 this week. We're going to look at chapter 9 next lesson, and then we're going to look at chapter 10. And the first part is dealing with the specific topic of food sacrificed to idols. The second part, chapter 9, is really Paul's going to be talking about examples. And if you notice in the notes here, I am actually just going to use the flow that David Garland's used in his commentary because I like it so well. It's a little bit different than the traditional view because I'll get into that. But I like the flow of it. I think it's a much better presentation of what he's trying to prove and what he's trying to demonstrate. And I think what's really important is, we're not worried about food sacrificed idols, right? We're not wandering around, let's go to the nearest temple and wonder whether we should eat that food or not, right? That's not part of our normal life. So you're like, we'll just kind of blow through this stuff. But what really Paul is doing, just like he's done every other time, he is coming back to foundational principles and understandings and then applying them, okay? And so from that perspective, many of the situations that we face today, we can use the exact same thinking, logic, and principles, even though we're not dealing with food sacrificed idols in our culture. Now, there's other cultures, this is completely applicable today. In the U.S., like I said, we're not worried about Artemis' temple and who brought to the Christmas fellowship some meat and going, I wonder if that's a food sacrificed idols. We're not worrying about any of that stuff. And let's rent out the banquet hall of the temple, right? We're not worrying about that kind of stuff. So we're going to look at the introduction of that whole concept this morning. And then next week, we're going to look at the examples Paul's going to give. And he says, okay, as I finish out this section, as I've given you this example, let me show you how I have applied it in different situations. And so the reality of those situations is he's trying to show how he has given up his liberty and put things aside for the sake of others, which is one of the key things we're going to look at this morning. And then the final part, chapter 10, he's now going to take examples from Israel's history about example of the Lord's Supper, and then bringing all the way back to, okay, now that I've talked to you about all these principles, let me give you some additional instructions of how you ought to think about this in regards to whether you eat food and how you eat food and all. Because he's not a legalist. He's not this black and white, that's the only answer solution. He is, again, applying principles, not just a list. Now, all that being said, one of the things that we have to realize is that and as a teacher, this is hard for me to say because we're sitting in Sunday school and we're learning, we're getting biblical knowledge. But you know what? Just having a lot of biblical knowledge as we're going to see this morning, is really not going to do you a lot of good by itself. If you notice, by itself. Not having any biblical knowledge and applying the other principles isn't going to do you a lot of good. Okay? So and Paul's not going to, and I'm not going to talk this morning that knowledge is bad. It isn't. Knowledge unconstrained and defined and applied can be bad, even though you know absolute truth. Okay, and as a teacher, of course, what do you want to do? You want to communicate truth to people. You want to say, here's what it says. But if you don't take that from what it says to what it means and how to apply it, what good is the knowledge? Right? You can know all the mathematics in the world, and if you don't balance your checkbook, assuming people do such things anymore, if anybody even knows what a checkbook is anymore, it doesn't do you any good. Your math skills do you no good if you're not going to apply them to solve a problem, right? So great and wonderful math, but it doesn't do you any good. So the same principles we're going to see are going to be applied here by Paul. And I want to be sensitive to the fact that all of these ideas of knowledge, and we're going to see love, and not the emotional thing of love, but actual biblical love, all work together to bring glory to God in everything we do. And so when we walk through this morning and through the next couple of weeks, we're going to see how Paul is using all of these principles to deal with a particular subject. And I think as we go through it, you're also going to see that we will be able to then take these same understandings and same principles and apply to the situations we live in. So understanding what Paul's trying to do and how he's trying to argue, it's quite amazing. He argues from such fundamental basic things. It's, the deductive reasoning, given this, therefore that, versus I know all this information and therefore here I build up to something. He basically says, because of these things that are true, let me show you how you should live. Because of these things we all know, now let me show you the implications of them. Does that make any sense at all? And so that's what we're going to be looking at this week, next week, and the following. So let's begin. Excuse me. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 6. And this is basically the introduction to, if you will, idol food. Not food that's sitting idly, but food given to idols. Okay, it's not just laying around after Thanksgiving where it's just not doing anything for me. Maybe that's weight gain. Idle food. It's waiting around like I don't know. But let's begin there. It says, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines he knows something, and he does not yet know as he ought, but if he does not yet know as he ought, but if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to eating food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be many so-called gods in heaven and on earth, and as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we are all things, and through him we exist. Okay? You can already see lots of verses that we just grab the pieces of them and not necessarily misapply, but there's a lot of verses here but this is part of an argument. Okay, this is put here for a purpose. It's still truth, but let's keep following through here. Now, as he begins, it says, now concerning food offered idols. If you remember the first 5 chapters of the letter, we're dealing with reports from Chloe's people. And then in chapters 6 and 7, he begins to deal, or chapter 7, he begins to deal with the issues of married and singleness and all that kind of stuff, right? And those were dealing with subjects that evidently the Corinthians have been ongoing discussion with him, and he's responding to their letter. Okay, this also appears to be the same thing. At minimum, it's a new topic, now concerning. Okay, there's a bunch of those now concernings in the letter. But most likely, this is an ongoing debate. And this is where, as I look at this, I tend to agree with Garland's analysis that this is probably not a a topic that has not already been broached. That Paul's coming up with this situation of, okay, we've got divisions and factions and we're fighting and all this other kind of stuff, and I'm strong and I'm weak, kind of a thing that we're going to see here in the next section. That this is really dealing with a situation where he says, look, guys, I've already been telling you about this stuff. I've debated you with this stuff. You're writing me more questions about this stuff. Here, let me make sure you understand how you are thinking about it, because you're not thinking about it right. And we'll look at what he says. We know we all have knowledge, okay? Isn't this sound very much like the Corinthians? Hey, look, we already got it figured out. We're smart, we're wise, etc. And we are going to reason out the problem here. And at the simplest level, they are correct in their analysis. They are unfortunately incorrect in their application. And the implications of the application are very significant. And that's why this is such a big deal. So again, I believe that this is much more an ongoing discussion and debate, that this whole setup is being used to explain to them that they're not thinking properly about this whole thing. Now, the other thing that I want to make sure that everybody remembers is food to idols to us doesn't mean a lot. To them, it meant life. Okay? This was how they had lived up until that point. This is how their culture works. You cannot separate food and idols and temples and society and politics and economics and relationships and family from these practices, because they're part and parcel of them. And I thought Garland had a really nice quote from a guy named Ye or Yo, or I don't know, Y-E-O. All right, anybody know how to pronounce that? I want to say Yo. A Chinese guy, so a guy with Chinese background. And he said, here's what it would be like in China, the same thing in Japan, other cultures. He said, to advise a Chinese not to offer food and not to eat food in ancestor worship may be implicitly advising them not to love their parents, not to practice love, and ultimately not to be Chinese. Okay? In Japan, I've talked with missionaries there, same thing. You become a Christian, you're abandoning all these practices, ancestor worship and all sorts of other stuff. And guess what? You're not Japanese anymore. And he's saying the same thing. If you start practicing these things, you're not Chinese anymore. Well, here, you're not Corinthian anymore. You're not one of us anymore. You abandon these things, it's like completely walking away from your entire society and everybody you are and all your social relationships and your family. So again, this is a big deal. That's why I believe that this is a topic that's an ongoing debate. Wouldn't that be a tough thing for you? Sorry, think about it. We just had Thanksgiving. Sorry, we're not going to get together for Thanksgiving anymore because it's a pagan festival. And, you're sacrificing turkeys to whoever, Santa, I don't know, before he comes to get I don't know, whatever you're doing. And therefore, we're going to walk away from it. Sorry, family, we're not going to get together with you and have Thanksgiving because the turkey is sacrificed to Santa. All right? You got that one? Okay. That's humorous enough anyway. It's a picture. I don't know if my voice is going to hold out. This is kind of crazy. So this is how big a deal it is. So when he says now concerning the food sacrificed to idols, it's important. We all know that we know that we all possess knowledge. And basically what he's basically saying is, guys, all of us, Christians, me, you, etc., have knowledge. We've got facts. We have information. We have truth. And he says, I'm not going to debate you about whether these are true. This knowledge, however, puffs up, but love builds up. And you're going, wait a second. I thought truth was supposed to be set you free, right? It does if what? What's Paul saying here? Again, this is where I want you to fall into the context of what he's saying. If he says we all have knowledge, this knowledge puffs up, but love builds up or love edifies. So what's he trying to say when he says, yes, we all have truth, I agree, you have it, we have it, I have it, we all understand it, but this knowledge puffs up, but love builds up or edifies. What do you think he's saying? Why is he making that connection? Does it mean that just because you know stuff that suddenly you're going to become proud? Because that's what it basically means, to be puffed up, to to become proud. That means, okay, I need to remain ignorant so I don't become puffed up. Right? Is that what he's trying to say? No. And it's interesting here, the way this is, well, I'm not going to go into that. There's a definite article in one place and a non-definite article in another place, so I'm not going to go into all that mess. The whole concept here is, he said, if you have knowledge and you don't understand how it is to be used, that knowledge merely is going to make you head smart and proud that, hey, I got it all figured out. Because look, I know the facts. I got the information. It's all done. And he says, but if you have that, you're just puffed up. What you need is love. And this isn't an emotion. Oh, I just have this great loving feeling kind of a thing. What's he trying to say in relationship to knowledge without love? Is it sort of, John?
Like if a weaker brother doesn't want to eat that stuff and thinks it's wrong, instead of just throwing it at their face and say, you can eat it, and then make them feel bad, you try to, I don't know, lovingly ease them into the knowledge that it's okay without pushing them.
Well, there is the point that it's concerning about other people, right? What are you supposed to do? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and ignore everybody else, right? No, and your neighbor as yourself. In other words, you are supposed to combine your knowledge of who God is and your love for him with your knowledge of how you're supposed to behave and what truth is in a relationship of love and caring for other people. Okay? And so what he's trying to say here is, yes, you've got a bunch of facts, and he's going to not debate them on their facts. He's going to restate, you are correct. But what you've done with the facts is not love. See the difference? That's why he says knowledge without love puffs up. Because you've just left this one thing, hey, I'm right, you're wrong. And you've forgotten the other person. And so when he's talking here, that's when he says that knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. He's not just saying ignore knowledge and just be loving. He's saying this knowledge without love puffs up. Does that make sense? It's misapplied and misunderstood. So look what he goes on and he says. He says, if anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not yet know as he ought to know. If he thinks he can just stop with the facts, he doesn't really understand what the facts are there for to begin with. When you communicate to somebody, you don't just say, here's a set of facts. What do you anticipate? You're going to do something. Okay, we have some parents in the back. When you tell your kids, hey, don't do that, what do you expect?
Absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing. You just say something, it's like, whatever, I just mentioned it, because that's not what, you're hoping. You're hoping against hope that there will be something that goes along with it. Now, forgive me for using a little more complicated stuff here, but I think it's been very helpful to me when I think about it. And I don't buy into all the mess that goes along with it, but there's a thing called speech-act theory. Yes, and you're like, oh no, theory. Basically, it's pretty straightforward, and it kind of goes along with what Paul's saying. He says, there is locution. Locution means the words you say. Okay, I have said something. There is illocution. And illocution means the meaning or the understanding of the words that I said. Okay, I have said something, now what does that mean? So, illocution. Locution, illocution. And then there is a thing called perlocution, which means, therefore I expect you to think or behave based on what the words I said and the meaning of those words to do something. Does that make any sense at all? So when you locute to your children, don't do that. There's a meaning behind it that means don't do that, even though that language for some reason seems to pass their brains. And therefore you have a perlocution, an expectation of change of thought and behavior. And so Paul's basically saying, if you think you understand the words, the question is, do you understand the meaning? Because I'm certainly not seeing an action that's commensurate with the understanding. You got the locution, you're misunderstanding the illocution, and therefore your behavior or perlocution is wrong. So if you think you've got it by just hearing the words and can restate the facts, that does not mean you really understand as you ought to understand. You don't. That's why he's making, since the person doesn't really understand as they ought to understand. Is this making any sense at all? Forgive me for doing that, but it makes it easier to try to break this stuff down. And you said, yes, easier for you. My brain works weird, so, and I'm on drugs right now, so who knows what I'm saying. So he says, but if anyone loves God, he is known by God. In other words, he's got this relationship. If you love God, in other words, you're going to act and think. Remember the wisdom we talked about earlier, that it's looking at it from God's perspective. If you love God, what are you going to do? Ignore others? No. You are going to be known by him and therefore behave as you're supposed to, because this is where be imitators of me and here's my actions and all the other kind of stuff. We have the mind of Christ. Remember all the stuff that Paul's talked about earlier in the letter? He's just bringing these same ideas and fundamentals back. And so what has he done here? He's basically said, look, I want you to think as God thinks. I want you to love as God loves. I want you to act in knowledge that is in the structure and the binding of loving behavior. Therefore, when we talk about these things, you will behave in a way not just, hey, you're right. Food doesn't mean anything, therefore who cares? Facts. Now what are you going to do with it? And so that's exactly what he says. Therefore, as to eating food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence. Fact. Locution. You're right. Now the question is, do you understand the meaning of what that's going to imply? And that there is no God but one. Great. You got it. You're orthodox. Right? Good job, Corinthians. I agree with you. I've got that knowledge. You got that knowledge. See? For although there are many so-called gods in heaven and earth, okay, so it's interesting here. He says, for indeed there are many so-called. In other words, he's saying, I agree with you, they're not real. As indeed there are many gods and lords. And you're like, wait a second, Paul, are you getting schizophrenic on me here? You said they're so-called, and yet there are. So why is he making this distinction between so-called, they don't exist, they're so-called, and yet he says, but there are many gods and lords? How does he say those two things in the same sentence?
The reality behind it, right, which is the fact that there's no real gods.
Okay.
From their perspective, from the culture's perspective, there are
many
gods.
Yeah, the reality is there aren't any gods. And later on, he is going to tie these gods to demons. Okay, so there is a reality, but the reality is in the culture you live in, there are many gods and lords. So you have to be aware that even though you know the facts that there aren't, the reality is there are. Does that make any sense? It's like the difference between the fact of something being true and the perception of something being true, right? I mean, isn't political and advertisements and all sorts of stuff based on getting you to perceive something to be true, whether it is or not? Who cares about the facts? I just believe that's right. Okay, well, your perception is that's right, and who cares about the facts? Right? Do the math, here's the physics, drop my glasses, they'll fall, but I don't believe they will. Therefore, if I drop them, they're not going to break, right? And so, therefore, he says, look, we all know the facts, and yet there's a reality that you have to deal with. In fact, later on, that reality isn't quite as unfactual as you might think, because there are demons behind this. And therefore, there is a reality behind this. They're just not gods. Right? So he's going, you have to live in that reality that you're in. And if you really think about it, the Bible teaches us how to live in the what is versus the what should be. It tells you what the should be is, but he says within that should be, that's what should be, but that's now how you have to live within what is, because that isn't what should be. I know that sounds weird. I'm in a weird mood today, aren't I? Perlocution, should be's, isn't, I don't know. But that's the thing that you have to realize is the Bible is trying to teach us how to live in the what should be. Here's the what should be, there aren't any gods, but what is, there are. That's the reality of what you deal with, Corinthians. That's how you have to behave in that knowledge. So again, he's already starting to take the facts and saying you're correct in your facts, but are you really applying them correctly? Are you really perceiving things as they are versus just the things that you want to just ignore? Because I want to ignore the reality because I know the truth, right? Isn't that sometimes we get trapped into that? We want to ignore the reality because, well, I know the truth. That's not real. Well, yeah, but to your kid it is. To your boss it is. To your coworker it is. Because that's the way it is. Okay. So then he goes on and he says, yet for us there's one God, the Father, from whom all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things and through whom we exist. Now, what's he grounding all this in? He's grounding it back into Christ. He's grounding it back into the reality of God and who he is, and that we have peace and relationship through Christ to God the Father. And he is our creator. Isn't it interesting? Paul makes these same arguments back in Romans. Hey, let's go back to these arguments. Let's go back to the basics. Look at how things are. Look at who God is. And it's funny if we just begin to really know God for who he is and what he has done. Many of the decisions and issues we have in our life aren't quite as complicated anymore. And that's why he just keeps bringing them back and bringing them back and bringing them back. Not to say simple Christianity, but fundamental Christianity. And there's a difference between those things, right? In physics and mathematics and science and engineering and anything, the simple principles, equals MC squared, it's really, there it is. There's a simple equation, which isn't actually the equation, but close enough. The equation is simple, and that's fundamental, but it has profound implications to it. Atomic bombs, nuclear energy, all sorts of other stuff. So a very simple foundational thing, but it's not simplistic, if you will. And so when he brings them back, it's profound that God's your creator. It's profound that you find God and the Father through Christ. And he says, and that's what you've got to realize when we're even beginning to talk about this. There aren't any other gods in relationship to food sacrificed to idols. If you notice, how much have we talked about, well, it's right or wrong to give to idols and anything yet? Have we talked about any of that yet? No, because he still wants us to come back to, you have knowledge, but let's examine your knowledge. Do you really understand what this knowledge means? Okay. Now, I don't have time to go into it, but if you go back and read Romans 14 and 15, there's a lot of these similar topics, but if you look at the language very carefully, they're probably dealing with two different areas of dealing with food. In 14 and 15, it's probably dealing more in the lines of Jewish dietary law. And in this, we're dealing with food sacrificed to idols. And in one, he's dealing with the weaker and the stronger and, whether you could eat meat or vegetables and all that other kind of stuff. Versus here, he's going to be dealing directly with these as food sacrificed to idols and how you work with it, okay? Similarities, but they're not the same arguments. Similar words, but they're not the same words. He uses different things. So if you go back and look at those two sections, a lot of times people take Romans 14 and 15 and read over the top of 1 Corinthians. And I don't think that that's the best answer, though there's some supportive information in them and similar ideas. They're not the same arguments. So, but that's for a whole nother class. But we're not going to cover it. So it's fun. Okay. So now let's look at 7 through 13. So we've kind of looked at love and knowledge, and we've kind of looked at the arguments applied to idols. All right. Now it says, however, not all possess this knowledge. What knowledge? Not everybody possesses this knowledge. What knowledge is he pointing to? And this is where this knowledge is very specific, and the original knowledge this is where the definite article and indefinite article are being dealt with. Here, this is a very specific, this knowledge. What knowledge might he be talking about? Well, see, this is the fact that the idols aren't real gods, etc., is part of his we all have knowledge. He says this knowledge that it's just a set of facts, puffs up. But the thing you need to understand is the knowledge that's associated with love. He says not everybody gets this. Not everybody really understands this. Not everybody really grasps what I'm going to try to teach you. So what's the danger if people don't get it? What's going to happen? Well, it could cause a division. It will. But think about it. If I give you a simple argument and you apply it in a simple manner, will you necessarily come to the correct conclusion? No. And so what he's saying is, you who, later on he's going to talk about, you who are strong and think you've got this knowledge nailed, and you realize that, yes, there's only one Lord, one God, one Savior, one anything. These other idols don't really exist. And therefore, whether I eat food or don't eat food, which he's going to argue, it doesn't matter, does it? It's not about the food you're eating. It's irrelevant. And if you stop there, which is what those without true knowledge might, the knowledge that comes with love, might stop and think, they don't have this knowledge of now how do I apply it in love, what's going to potentially happen to these people? Without cheating and reading ahead. What's going to happen? What is the potential for these people who do not have this full knowledge, if you will? This understanding of not just the facts. They could be led into error, right? They could be led into sin. They could be stumbled. They could have problems. He says, so the fact that a lot of these people don't have this knowledge, I'm not debating they don't understand God, but they don't understand in relationship of how I'm supposed to think and act. I've got locution, but my perlocution's weak, and therefore my illocution's weak, and therefore my perlocution's going to be completely off. And so he says, all right, but some, though through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. He says, so some of these folks that we're talking about here have grown up with this as part and parcel of their entire life. Everything about their life is they're doing this. And so if they see you doing it, and this is what's going to become the argument, if they see you doing this and they don't recognize what they're really dealing with, this is going to create a problem. This is going to defile them. And this idea of conscience, and I like the analogy one of the commentators used. He says it's the best way to understand it in this context is your moral compass. Okay? And he says it's like your moral compass got demagnetized. What good is a compass that doesn't have the magnet in it? Just spins freely. Yes, north, south, east, west, woo, but you don't know where you're really going. He said, so basically it's these people who have this moral compass that's basically been demagnetized because there's no directing force in it. Because they're so used to this and they see nothing else to stop them. Because, hey, food, idols, who cares? It's not real. What is going to happen to somebody who starts eating it as if it was sacrificed to an idol? Starts behaving as if it is. What's going to happen to them? It's going to defile them. See, that's what's defiling them, not the food. It's their thinking towards this food. All right? And he says, it will not commend us to God. He says, you're right. Food's not going to commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. In other words, he's going back. Remember your argument? There's no gods and the foods really doesn't matter. So, guys, what am I trying to teach you? I'm trying to teach you that it isn't about the food. You're right, it's not about the food. It's not that there's no idols. That's not the point. Right? So he's just saying all this stuff that you may think is the logical conclusion is not the logical conclusion because it's not about that. So if you notice here, this gives us that same type of, let's look at our practices and how we behave in certain situations and step back and say, I am logically correct in all of my conclusions. And yet, you're still wrong. Isn't that sad? That you can just reason and use the scriptures and still be wrong. And you're right, but you're still wrong. Because that knowledge is going to make you think, hey, I got this nailed. But it's not going to be edifying. And if it isn't edifying, what good is that knowledge? It's not of any value. And he says, but take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. He says, so you people who think you got it, and yes, you got it, but don't think that this freedom or this right that you have is going to be okay just to use, if you forgive the expression, willy-nilly. You shouldn't be thinking that way because it's becoming a stumbling block to those who don't really understand. And what's that going to do? That's going to defile them, because look what he says. For if anyone sees you have knowledge eating in a idol's temple, in other words, those who know you understand, and then they see you eating in the idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? He's saying, you have just set an example that says, yes, you could do this because, yes, it's not real. But what have you done in reality? What have you really done in reality to that person? They're eating it as if it's okay to eat food sacrificed to idols as if the gods really exist. Because you're doing it. You're the one who's now setting this example, and they say, well, she's doing it, he's doing it, they're doing it. What's the problem? Right? Isn't it funny that people, if you have a group of folks and nobody joins, it's almost impossible to get a volunteer. But once you get one volunteer, then you'll get 2 volunteers, and once you get 2 volunteers, you'll get 5 volunteers, and once you get 5 volunteers, you'll get about 85% of the people. And you're suddenly going, what changed? It's okay for somebody else to do it. I guess I can do it too, right? Even though maybe I wanted to start with. Or maybe I think that's the right thing I should be doing because everybody else is doing it. He says, so when you start saying it's okay because there's no real gods and the food doesn't do anything, you are now setting the it's okay to do it precedent. And what is going to happen to the one who is weak or doesn't have that strong moral compass, who realizes do not be associated with the idols, because Paul's eventually going to come back to that whole issue. Guys, being associated with idols is wrong. And by what you're doing, it's wrong. And he goes on and he says, and so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother whom Christ died. And he's like, whoa, you just brought this back to the destruction of a brother for whom Christ died. What would be a simple way of another way of expressing that? And putting it back to those with knowledge. Now think about it this way. Christ died for this person. The creator of the universe. The Lord of Lords took on the sins of the world at propitiation, took on God's wrath. He died for this brother, whom you are destroying. Why are you destroying them? Because you say, hey, I've got knowledge, it's not a big deal, who cares? He's saying, the Lord himself gave himself for this person. You are destroying that person because you're not even thinking about what this is going to do to their conscience. So notice we suddenly have a big deal. And it has nothing to do with food or meeting or eating or anything else. It has to do with, by your behavior of something that you know you have freedom in, you are taking somebody from whom Christ died and destroying them. And you're not willing to give up your social standing. You're not willing to give up your relationships for that person for whom Christ died. Question?
Is this doctrine different than the doctrine sees when the Israelites went into the land of Canaan and they had all their different gods?
Is this different?
Weren't they told specifically not
It's the same type of idea that they are not to be involved. That's what Paul's going to come back to. Is the whole thing is this: don't be associated with idols or idol worship. But in the bigger principle that he's trying to deal with is, how do you behave? And this is a specific situation dealing with idolatry. And look at all the different things that are going to come along with it. So, yes, it specifically goes back to don't be associated with idols, just like Israel wasn't supposed to be associated with idols. And so if you notice here, what later on here in chapter 10, he's going to come back to the very specifics back in Numbers when Israel, went after idols. And he's saying, look at the destruction that came along with them.
Would this be an example of law on one side and gospel on the other?
It could be considered law and God. It could be that, but I think that what he is trying to say, yes, there is, stay away from idols. You shouldn't be, and that's just general, which you could consider part of law or whatever. But in the bigger picture, yes, I guess you could say gospel thinking, God thinking. But see, the Israelites were supposed to also think this way; they just didn't. Okay, here, so he's now coming back to them, and he says, "All right. So by your knowledge, this person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus," okay, see, it's not been a big deal yet. "Thus, sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ." Whoa, wait a second. I thought we were just talking about meat sacrificed to idols and we're free and we know there's no food that's going to do anything to us and, there aren't any other gods. And he's suddenly turning it and he goes, "But by what you're doing, you are sinning against Christ." Wow. So if you notice, here's the facts. But if you don't bind it with love, what are you going to end up with? Sinning against Christ himself. Because what you're doing is harming a brother, even though your facts are correct. So if you notice here, this is where he's getting into that whole gospel thinking. God-oriented thought. True wisdom, not the wisdom you think you have, because I have an airtight argument, right? I got an airtight argument. Here's the rules. I'm good. He says, yes, but you forgot love. Your knowledge has done you no profit because it is no longer edifying. Matter of fact, not only is it not edifying, it's sinning against your brother and against Christ. Pretty amazing, isn't it? And he says, "Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble." So he went all the way back and says, I can do this, you could do this, but I'm not going to do this. Because if what I'm doing is harming them, I'd rather not eat meat. In other words, I'm willing to give up for their sake, even though it's fine. There's no problem with it. Matter of fact, again, when we get to the end of chapter 10, we're going to see that Paul's even going to start talking about, look, don't make an issue if somebody serves you meat. Don't go, hey, was that sacrificed to idols? I need to be pure. I don't want to eat meat sacrificed to idols. He's like, no. If they do, don't ask. If they don't tell you, eat it with joy and thankfulness, praising God for what he gave you, because it's irrelevant. However, if they do ask and they do tell you and they do say it is, then don't eat. You're like, oh, dude, don't tell me that, right? Just let me enjoy. Because I know it means nothing, but now I guess it's a conscience issue for you. All right, now I'm not going to be able to eat, so I got to have salad, and I mean, it's just, what else am I going to do? And you don't even have good dressing here, oil and vinegar. I'm tired of it. I want some ranch. It's a completely different thing. So when we're going to watch here, what's he doing? He's saying, if this causes me to stumble, my thinking is love for my brother. Because I love God. I know God. I know what Christ did for this brother. I love this brother so much that I won't even eat meat if that's what it takes. A little bit hyperbolic, but I think Paul means it. Because what's he going to do in chapter 9? He is going to give us 3 big examples of how he has taken his rights, his freedom as an apostle, and saying, look, I have these rights, and I'll show you why I have them. Oh, by the way, because I don't want the gospel stumble or hurt, I'm not taking advantage of what is my right as an apostle. So in other words, instead of demanding it's right, therefore I can do it, he's saying it is right, I could do it, but I'm not going to for your sake and the sake of the Gospels. So if you notice, this is where this whole logic continues, and it flows all the way into chapter 10 as he comes back to the whole point of idols. Therefore, let me explain to you how you should deal with this situation. Is this all making sense now? How it all flows together? Now, real quick before we close, give me a couple of examples of how we might apply this same principle today. Just being off the top of your head. Alcohol.
I have somebody who has cholesterol issues and he's pre-diabetic, and so I know someone who will put certain things in front of him because he doesn't want to cause trouble.
Yeah, trying to keep somebody away from something that they probably ought not have. Yeah. Question? No? Communion? What way?
And some people believe that the wine and bread actually turns into blood and flesh of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
In reality.
In reality. So how would you apply this principle to that?
I still do communion.
Uh-huh.
And
But because
I respect,
by respect the way they look at it. Gotcha.
belief. Yeah.
Right.
May not. We agree that we disagree.
We agree that you disagree.
Baby baptism,
Baby baptism.
Presbyterian.
Presbyterian versus believer baptism type of stuff. Yeah, there's potentials in there. What about in just your everyday life? How might this come into play in your everyday life? Because again, we want knowledge with love. How can we bring something we know is true, and yet we can bring it in a way that is loving? Well, think about this. And yes, this is heresy. What about your evangelism? Is your entire life, that's all you're doing? Evangelize. I got to present the gospel constantly. I know people that no matter where they go, they have to present the gospel. I sometimes ask them and say, well, why don't you live the gospel? Not saying don't say it, but if everybody knows that you're going to be in their face constantly, what profit are you bringing to anybody with all of your knowledge? And I'm not saying don't share the gospel. However, what do most people look at? Wow, look how loving this person was. Look how this person cared. Look how this, we were helping somebody's son move down, into the area. And there's a bunch from the college group and some our community group and all helping out. And the person was just like, I'm totally staggered by your care for me. Your church actually did that. You cared. See, the living gospel was right there. And the guy goes, wow, I've never seen anything like this. So see, sometimes you can live the gospel through love. And I'm not saying don't share the gospel because you got to know the truth, right? We're not, but that truth has to be lived out. It can't just be talked about. And when you're just talking about it and you're not living it, how does anybody know that it's real? You have knowledge, but that knowledge is puffing you up. Aren't you holier than thou? Don't you're the Bible thumper, you're whatever. You ever heard that?
Or it's about walking your walk. It's like actions are louder than words.
Yeah, your actions are louder than your words. And again, I'm not saying don't share the gospel, but I'm just saying that there are some people, it's the gospel all the time. I'm like, yes, right. Live every single solitary day with all that knowledge you have in love to edify that person to God's glory, because that is what you want to be doing, right? That beautiful balance. And we can take these same principles and apply them. And as we see, Paul's going to show how he has rights to do stuff and how he's restricted his rights for the sake of other people. And that's what we're going to pick up with next week.